You keep checking the wrong scoreboard. You look at a nation's GDP. You scroll past charts about exports. You listen to economists explain growth, and you assume that a richer country automatically means a happier life. But happiness does not live in spreadsheets. Happiness lives in the quiet moment when you open your bank app and realize the rent is due, again, and the number keeps climbing. The real question is not how much a society produces. The real question is how much it charges its people just to have a roof over their heads. This video is about the hidden mechanism behind life feels harder every year. It is about how housing pressure quietly rewires your nervous system, steals your options, and trains entire generations to give up on love, stability, and even hope. And yes, I'm going to talk about Vietnam, but not as a motivational poster. I'm going to show you the psychological trap forming in real time, the one that can turn a short honeymoon into a long collapse. Let's start with a truth that most people resist because it feels too personal. When housing costs rise beyond a certain point, the economy stops being an abstract concept and becomes a direct force on your mental health. Not later, not in some far future. Right now, in your daily choices, in how tense you are at night, in how quickly you snap at your partner, in whether you can relax long enough to enjoy anything. People think the problem is simply money, but money is only the surface. The deeper problem is uncertainty. The deeper problem is that housing becomes a god that you cannot negotiate with. In many countries, and increasingly in Vietnam, the cost of a home has turned into the most powerful variable in the structure of everyday life. Not because it's just expensive, but because it is non-negotiable. You cannot opt out of shelter. You cannot delay it without paying the price. You cannot substitute it with a different choice like you can with a streaming service or a restaurant habit. Housing doesn't ask for preferences. Housing demands compliance. Picture your income as a pie. In a healthy society, housing is a slice, not the whole thing. Ideally, you spend enough to live, and then the rest of your pie goes to building your future. Education, health, savings, travel, family time, creativity, the ability to absorb shocks. Now picture reality. In too many places, housing eats 40, 50, even 60% of usable income. Usable income is the money after taxes and mandatory costs. It is the money you can actually use to breathe. When housing takes that much, you lose your ability to choose. Not only choices like buying a nicer car, you lose choices like buying healthier food. You lose choices like taking time off when you're sick. You lose choices like moving toward a better job because you are too busy keeping up with the landlord's demand. And here's the cruel part. The threat does not only come from the cost itself, it comes from the lack of a buffer. Without a buffer, every small emergency becomes catastrophic. A broken phone becomes a week of stress. A medical bill becomes a fight. A friend's wedding becomes a calculation. Do I show up and drain my savings, or do I stay home and feel ashamed? This is how housing pressure creates chronic anxiety. It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels normal. It feels like that's just life now. And the mind learns to accept a low-grade alarm as the baseline. This leads to the first pillar of what housing pressure does. It destroys financial freedom. When your home consumes most of your income, you stop building, you start surviving. The future becomes a debt schedule instead of a plan. You stop investing in yourself because you can't afford to be wrong. I've seen this play out in 1,000 micro stories. A couple in their late 20s who both work, both have degrees, both are not lazy. They sit at a dinner table and speak in quiet numbers. How much is rent? How much is the deposit? How much can we save if we move? If we buy, what's the down payment? If we rent for 5 more years, what happens when prices keep moving? Then you notice something. They don't talk about dreams as much. The dreams are still there, but they're shrinking like muscles that stopped being used. They talk about logistics because logistics feels controllable. Dreams feel risky. That is the psychological transformation. The brain starts treating life like a spreadsheet because emotional risk is too expensive. The second pillar. Housing shapes your microenvironment, and your microenvironment shapes your body. Most people underestimate how much your space influences your nervous system. You can call it just the room you live in, but the body does not think like that. The body reads your environment like a threat map. A cramped apartment, with poor ventilation, with noise leaking in all day, with dampness in the corners, trains your body into irritation. You stop sleeping deeply. You start waking up tense. Your stress hormones don't drop fully because your mind never fully believes you are safe. Noise is not only annoying, it steals cognition. Chronic irritation makes it harder to concentrate, harder to regulate emotions, harder to be patient. You end up blaming your personality or blaming your partner when the real culprit is the hidden soundtrack of your life. Then there's location. Living far from public services might save money today, but it taxes your life with commuting time, exposure to traffic stress, and fewer opportunities to rest. In a healthy society, people have real access to healthcare, schools, transport, parks, and community spaces. In a stressed society, people spend their best hours trapped between work and survival. A good home, by contrast, gives the brain permission to recover. Quiet, green space, safety, enough room to be a person, not just a tenant. When housing becomes unstable or unpleasant, you don't just suffer temporarily, you compound. This is why housing pressure turns into health decline. It's not only what you can buy, it's what your body absorbs every day. And if you think the story ends with adults, you're missing the third pillar. Housing is the cradle of the next generation. Young children absorb their environment like a sponge. They do not understand property law. They understand safety and chaos. They understand whether their home is calm enough for play, whether there is space to move, whether adults fight because the walls are thin and the bills are loud. When housing is cramped, families become more conflict-prone. Couples fight more. Patience shrinks. The home becomes a place where people are tense, because tension is the cheapest emotion to maintain when you're overwhelmed. Then, education becomes harder too. A child needs a stable place to study, a corner that belongs to learning, not just storage. They need routines that don't get disrupted by frequent moves. And moving repeatedly is not only inconvenient, it is identity disruption. Every move teaches a child that stability is temporary. It whispers, you can lose your place at any moment. That lesson doesn't disappear when they grow up. It becomes part of how they relate to the world. So housing pressure is not only a cost issue, it is a psychological curriculum. Fourth pillar, the invisible psychological burden. This is the one nobody wants to talk about because it's harder to measure. It's not the rent receipt. It's the dread between paydays. It's the fear of eviction. It's the fear that you will never catch up. It's the quiet despair when you check listings and realize you're always behind. A person can still function. That's what makes it dangerous. Housing stress often doesn't look like a breakdown. It looks like someone who works hard, smiles politely, and internally feels trapped. Chronic stress is not one big catastrophe. It's a slow corrosion. It steals joy in small increments. You stop feeling excited about weekends. You stop feeling confident about planning a vacation. You stop trusting that next year will be better. You become cautious. You become smaller. And over time, this can drift into depression and anxiety disorders. It can also show up as irritability, burnout, emotional numbness, and insomnia. But because it comes from life circumstances, people treat it like it's temporary mood, not a pattern the brain has been forced to learn. Now let's talk about the research without pretending science is a shield against denial. Studies across Europe and Australia have found that when housing costs rise beyond safe thresholds, people's mental health worsens even when their income stays the same. That means the problem is not just having less money. The problem is the shift into instability and burden. When the housing cost ratio crosses certain levels, the body changes how it reacts to stress. You activate a prolonged stress response. Your immune system and mental well-being both suffer. The mind stops operating from future safety and starts operating from threat management. This is the hidden truth. The body does not care about your intentions. The body cares about your lived experience of safety versus risk. In China, where urbanization moved faster than most people can psychologically process, housing pressure became a national phenomenon. As housing cost burdens increased in major cities, anxiety, depression, and hopelessness among young people rose too. Not because they are weak, because they are overloaded. And then, when some burden eases, happiness indicators improve. That is crucial. It means housing pressure is not fate. It is a manipulable variable. Remove the threat, and people start breathing again. This brings us to the next layer. How to evaluate whether a society is easy to live in. Some people will tell you happiness is about culture. Some will tell you it's about individual mindset. Some will tell you it's about being grateful. That's comforting, but it's not accurate. Sociologists look at a balance of variables that shape most of what a person experiences. Housing, median income, basic cost of living for essentials. Housing is the biggest lever because it is expensive and hard to cut. You can't easily replace shelter. It also takes a large chunk of time and mental capacity. When housing is controlled, budgets soften. People can buy what they need and still have room to live. Median income matters more than average income because averages can be inflated by a small group of super rich. Real life is lived by the middle, not by the top. And essentials matter because they determine whether the person can stay functional. Essentials include food and the basic healthcare and education needs that cannot be delayed forever. If these essential costs are balanced with income, people feel life is manageable. If they are not, the entire household turns into a risk management unit. Vietnam and parts of Southeast Asia still have an advantage on essentials. Food and basic services can be relatively cheaper compared to high-income countries. That creates a cushion. People can feel life is still okay even when income is not high. But cushions are fragile. They don't protect you against housing becoming a storm system. Now, the hidden self needs to pay attention to the way systems trick you. Many people in Vietnam still enjoy a honeymoon effect. They can afford basic life at a lower cost. A cheap bowl of noodles, affordable coffee, and low-cost internet can make daily life feel light. But the danger is that people confuse this lightness with stability. It can vanish quickly if housing and education costs rise faster than wages. This is where I'm going to stop being polite. If you live in a society where housing costs rise beyond what people can handle, then the social contract begins to rot. The social contract says, work hard, build a home, have a family, become stable. When housing breaks that promise, people respond in predictable ways. They postpone marriage, they postpone children, they reduce emotional risk, they treat commitment as a financial trap. They stop planning because planning becomes superstition. You don't need a survey to see this. You feel it. You see fewer weddings in your friend group. You see more people living alone longer. You hear "will decide later" become a phrase that never ends. Now let's deepen. Housing pressure doesn't act alone. It combines with other stresses like education and healthcare cost inflation, weak social protection, job insecurity, social pressure, and uneven opportunity. Think of these as seasonings on a bitter stew. Each one makes the bitterness harder to swallow. First seasoning, social safety nets. A strong welfare system does something psychologically powerful. It removes the fear of the future. If a person believes that unemployment or illness will not destroy them, their nervous system can calm down. They can focus on life and growth instead of constant dread. This is why some Northern European societies produce higher happiness even with high taxes. People are not only taxed, they are protected. Protection changes behavior. It turns life from a series of disasters into a manageable timeline. Second seasoning, macro stability. Inflation is invisible but brutal. It turns wages into theater. People feel poorer every month even if their income rises on paper. Inflation creates a sense that reality is cheating them. Third seasoning, culture and social pressure. Even if someone has money, culture can cage them. A society that demands constant achievement creates invisible prisons. You must be successful, own property, look a certain way, perform competence at all times. That pressure creates shame when life doesn't match the script. Fourth seasoning, safety and order. The ability to walk outside without fear is not a luxury, it's security, and security is mental health. When you lack safety, you waste cognitive energy on threat scanning. You can't rest, you can't trust. Fifth seasoning, upward mobility. Hope is a resource. If people believe effort leads to progress, they try. If the system is rigid and rewards are sealed, frustration rises. People stop trying, or they try in destructive ways. Sixth seasoning, work-life balance. Time is the only non-renewable currency. If a culture treats exhaustion as a badge, then people live in permanent depletion. They cannot rebuild the self. They cannot connect deeply. They become functional robots. Seventh seasoning, environmental quality. Clean air and water are not aesthetic. They are survival necessities. When people breathe dirty air daily, they become more physically stressed, more vulnerable, and more emotionally reactive. So yes, housing is the main actor, but it performs with a full cast of supporting pressures that amplify suffering. Now I want to show you the uncomfortable contrast story between regions, because this is where self-deception usually hides. Europe, especially Germany and France, often represents stable housing price models. People pay more tax and living costs may be high, but they receive protection. Free or affordable education, quality healthcare with reasonable costs, and labor laws that protect rest. This produces balance. People worry less, even if they are not rich in the flashy way. The United States and the UK, on the other hand, represent high opportunity but high risk. Median income may look good, but the cost structure can crush stability. Without universal health care and with expensive education, the middle class lives on the edge. One serious illness can bankrupt a family. That means the financial system behaves like a lottery, where the prize is what your health remains fine. People can be materially wealthy and still psychologically fragile. This is the real irony. A society can rank high on income but low on peace. Now let's talk about East Asia. because this is the warning sign that the world sometimes ignores. Japan in the late 1980s became obsessed with real estate. Then the bubble burst in the early 1990s, and the country stepped into a long decade of loss. Even when prices stabilized later, the psychological damage remained. Add a work culture that pushes people to exhaustion, plus social pressure, and you can get a weird outcome. Economic wealth without emotional nourishment. People can become lonely and less happy, not because they lack intelligence, but because stability was damaged and the system trained them to endure pain without healing it. South Korea is another case. Young people talk about hell in casual terms because the stress is not theoretical. Housing prices skyrocketed while wages didn't keep up. Young families had to postpone food, sacrifice life, and endure long periods of deprivation just to buy an ordinary apartment. This pressure didn't exist alone. It mixed with intense competition in education and with obsession about appearance. When the pressure becomes total, it kills reproductive desire. Birth rates collapse, and people quietly resist a world they can no longer afford. China, too, shows the three mountains narrative: education, healthcare, and housing. When all three rise together, the dream of stability becomes unreachable, and young people respond by rejecting conventional paths. Some even refuse the standard script. Don't strive, don't buy, don't marry. It's not laziness, it's a rational response to the belief that effort will not buy safety. Now, the point is not to romanticize any culture. The point is to identify the mechanism. When economic growth pairs with runaway housing prices, the promised happiness rarely reaches the majority. Latin America complicates this further. Costa Rica ranks high on happiness despite not being a wealthy powerhouse. The balance matters. Enough income to live, natural environment, and a lower pressure lifestyle. Meanwhile, Argentina shows the danger of inflationary collapse. Even with good cultural and educational foundations, when the economy destabilizes, savings get eaten, and anxiety becomes permanent. Mexico and Brazil sit in the middle. Income may be higher than Vietnam, and living conditions can feel comfortable, but insecurity and inequality become haunting. So if you were to build a ranking of real median life compared to Vietnam, the order might look different than the ranking of happiness. Happiness can shift based on how systems treat people's fear and stability. Now we return to Vietnam, and here the truth becomes sharp. Vietnam is currently benefiting from a honeymoon phase of a rising economy. Even if income is not high, basic living costs like food, services, and telecommunications are comparatively low. People can still feel life flows. But this honeymoon is fragile. It's threatened by two major storms. First, an urban housing price storm. In Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, the dream of owning a home is moving further away from young people. The ratio of housing prices to income is rising fast. People start seeing a familiar pattern from East Asia: speculative expansion, social housing supply that can't keep up, and young people forced into smaller rentals far from opportunity. When housing becomes a burden rather than a foundation, social behavior shifts. People become hesitant to marry. People become hesitant to have children. Stress increases across the social fabric, and what makes this invisible is that it doesn't always show up as obvious violence or obvious failure. It shows up as delay, loneliness, and emotional fatigue. Second, a double inflation of education and healthcare costs. Beyond housing, families face rising costs for private schooling, extra classes, language programs, and high-quality medical services. These costs can climb faster than wage growth. So the urban middle class becomes trapped in a sandwich. They must support aging parents while retirement systems don't cover everyone reliably, and they must also fund children's education and healthcare